I am Howard Summers. I live in Canton, Ohio. I served 3.5 years ready for combat, and fortunately none. I missed it several times. I was in mapping overseas, and 1.5 years overseas. Engineers. No, they, Air Force furnished aerial photographs for us to make our maps, and believe it or not, the majority of the photographs were 40 to 50,000 feet, and we had to make our maps from them accurately within 10 feet for artillery fire. Wow. I was assistant art director at the Hoover Company, and Mr. Hoover called me, H.W. called me to his office when he heard that I was leaving, and said, "I've taken the liberty of writing a letter of recommendation for you," which I've never used, but he said, "I want you to remember that your job will be here when you come back." And he was a tremendous and very creative man. It was his great ability that made the Hoover name what it was. But when I came back, it was a different company, and I left. It was 1942. They were drafting us, and I thought, rather than end up in the infantry, I would like to get in the Air Force. So I went down to the Columbus Air Force to enlist, and a colonel asked me what I wanted, and I said I'd like to enlist in the Air Force. And he said, "How old are you?" And I said, 28. And he said, "You're too old. Go back and wait till you're drafted." And it was only a couple months after that that I received my greetings. And that was down to Fort Hays, Columbus, and then Fort Belvoir. And I was pretty rugged basic training in the engineers, and I had hoped to become an officer, and at the end of the basic training I received a citation, which was my ticket to officer's training, but the quota was filled, and so they sent me to Lexington, Kentucky, to the university to study mapping. They said I'd be a better officer if I knew mapping. And then when the course ended, they interviewed me and said, "We've been watching you and we'd like to have you teach." And I said, "No, I'm going to go to officer's training." And they said, "Well, if you'd teach, we'd put you in a big camp near a big city, and you'd have quarters on the post with your wife for a year." I said, "You just got a teacher. I'll go to officer's training later." As a result of that, 3 different times here and overseas, I got bawled out for not being an officer, and they wanted me to sign up. But the circumstances at the time, I turned it down. One, I figured the war would be over. Another one, I'd be caught up in the Army of Occupation. But years later, I learned that some of the men that went in when I were killed, so it was the Lord watching over me. Well, that's about it. The ETO, there were lots of interesting things happened to me. I was bawled out by General de Gaulle. I rang a big bell in the Free French headquarters, and with a gun in my back and my neck, I was escorted up to his office, and he was pounding his desk and red-faced. I couldn't understand it, but I knew it was Army talk about the dumb Americans. And he went alons and got me out of there. I still regret that when they pushed me past his desk, I didn't stop and salute him and try to shake hands with him. I know he wouldn't have. And then another time, after the war was over, we were at a football game up in Darmstadt. It was a division football game to keep the troops occupied. And at halftime, two soldiers walked across the field and sat beside me closer than you and I are for the whole second half. So someone took a picture of that. So I have a picture of me sitting beside General Patton and General Eisenhower. I was on that corner in Heidelberg about 15 minutes after General Patton was in that accident. They never reported it correctly, but that's typical. Well, in any vehicle, the ranking officer has control of the speed of the car. And when they were driving along the river, and when a young fellow came off the bridge, there was a collision. But the car that Patton was in was going about 40, 45 miles an hour in a 20-mile-an-hour zone. And so when they hit, it threw Patton forward and broke his neck. And or very seriously, as I recall, it was broken, but he never recovered for that. I do have the date and letters I wrote, but that was the way it actually happened. Yeah. Well, we ended up in Normandy, and I had a lot of experiences up there, non-combatant. And then we were stationed in the outskirts, northeast outskirts of Paris. We took over a large 4-story printing company, L'Illustration, that was the largest printing company in Europe, and it printed all the Army notices, papers, and so forth for the same sector. And we were stationed in tents, the 16-man tents, for 2 winters and a summer. We lived like pigs, and the French people used to ask, why are you living like this when your German prisoners are living better than you are? But we worked 3 shifts trying to get our maps out so that they got there in time to, or like Patton's advance troops, get the maps to them to show them where they were going instead of where they'd been. And there were always follow-ups and so forth. But because of what we were doing, we usually knew in advance what was happening or going to be tried. So we never dared write any of that home because our censorship was very severe, and it's understandable. But I climbed around in the German pillboxes up in the along the cliffs, walked through a minefield, and a few other dumb things. We were throwing the German potato mashers over the cliffs down 300 feet. They're hand grenades. They're like a potato masher. But what I had thought I might talk about was crossing the ocean in the ship, because so many hundreds of thousands of troops got to their destinations, either in the Pacific or the Atlantic. And I was on a converted ocean liner, and so I thought I would talk about life aboard the ship, which might remind men of things that they have forgotten. I know when we docked, the ship looked like a great big wall with covered portholes in it. It wasn't anything like tourist ship advertisements that I had seen in the magazines. It was just the gray abstract colors for camouflage. But there was a band playing and Red Cross women giving us donuts and coffee, and everything was like a gala atmosphere. But I felt kind of sad because I knew it actually was goodbye, you guys, and good luck to you. We were marched up a gangplank and in the hole in the side of the ship, and suddenly you felt your life changing because it was just a big dark area and there were people yelling, go down, down, down. And we were, with our barracks bag, clambering down these metal steps, and we went down several decks into a hold. And there were bunks, or just things that were let down and held by a chain, 5 high. And in the aisle, we piled our barracks bags, so to get through it, you had to climb over them. And the bunks sunk so that if you wanted to turn over, you had to swing out, turn over, and go back in, because the fellow's backside was almost in your stomach. But you had to hang your helmet and web belt here. And during the rough seas, while fellows getting sick, they would just lay there day and night moaning, and if they had to throw up, why, they would turn their head and try to throw up in their helmet, but it would overshoot into the bunk's neck, so there were threats of murder, and the fellows, all they could do was say, let me go, I want to die. One of the fellows saw an officer and said, how many of us down in this hole? And the officer said 500 or more. So later on I learned there were over 5,000 on this ship. And one of the things that I remember was the food. It was terrible. They fed us 2 meals a day, but I can understand trying to feed 5,000 men 2 meals a day. But what we did, they would take us hold by hold and then group by group, and we would climb up a couple decks and down long passageways and down a narrow stairway. And the hot smells that came up there, many men would just turn around and go back to their bunk and eat a candy bar they'd brought with them. But I stuck it out and went down in, and I ended up in a little room about 25 feet square with boards that were about 2 feet wide and 10 feet long, and they handed you a tray with some sort of a concoction on it, and the boards were about chest high, so you had to stand there and pick out food that might be edible. And on the end of each board was a garbage can, and that's where you dumped your stuff. But I soon learned to eat over in the middle of the bunk, because some of the fellows would dump their stuff and then throw up in it, because the food was just terrible. And the latrine was another experience, or the head on a ship. My first experience there was up a couple decks in a small room with about 8 or 10 toilets, back to back with another 8 or 10, with a plumber's nightmare of pipes going between them, no toilet seats, and men standing waiting their turn and usually getting sick and throwing up. And there was a ridiculous network of pipes about shoulder high around each toilet, and that looked really ridiculous. But in the rough seas, those ridiculous pipes were very handy because you had to hold on to them to stay seated, because you could suddenly find yourself floating in the air in a sitting position. But I left there and went up for fresh air, saying I'd never go back down in there. But it wasn't long before I had to skid back into the place and see it. But up on deck, it was so crowded, and there was no daily schedule. There was a little mimeograph paper came out the first few days, but they'd been printed on a mimeograph machine that had had better days. The first couple days was the history of the ship, and that was interesting. But from then on, it was keep your mouth shut and don't talk. I enjoyed walking around the decks for exercise, but you couldn't walk far because you were always bumping into people. It was so crowded that you could hardly find a place to sit. One day, looking at the ships off to our side, I counted about 25 ships, and as an artist, I took my pen out and my sketch pad and started to sketch. And then when I looked up again, there was nothing there. Well, somebody told me that there was a 50-ship convoy, and every 15 minutes on a signal, the whole convoy would shift, so that they were in a constant zigzag course every 15 minutes. And this was to keep the German submarines from sighting on anyone as a target. As it was, there were several of our ships were sunk, but there were little ships running around, zigzagging all over the place all the time, and they were flashing red lights. And I thought that was very interesting until I learned that the red lights meant that we were under a submarine attack. But we were severely cautioned on deck at dusk, get below deck. No flashlights, no cigarettes, no lights or anything that would give a clue to where we are. And I know one day out there sketching, I had to quit up in the North Atlantic, my ink and my pen froze. One day while I was up on deck looking at the ships in the distance, you'd see a flash and smoke. And they were shooting out depth charges. And I said, gee, they look pretty far away. And one of the smarter fellows told me that if you, when you saw the flash, you started counting, your number of seconds would tell you pretty accurately how far away the ships were. And I was amazed when I learned the number of miles between ships out there. Because at night, at a signal, I learned that our ship was the command ship of this convoy. But what I learned was at darkness, all ships on signal took a compass course, spread out, went full speed all night long. They abandoned the zigzag course until daylight. And one of the things that surprised me that when a ship was hit by a torpedo, why the whole convoy kept going. Because if a ship slowed down, they would become a target too, so that ship and men had to suffer whatever the consequences were. And past mid-Atlantic, several ships left for the Azores, and a number of them were sunk. So I'm glad I wasn't in that group, because we were zigzagging up to the North Atlantic. And I saw one day a crew member open a door and disappeared in it. And so I opened that door, and there was steps down to the next deck, but there was a big sign and it said no trespassing, crew members only. And of course that was an invitation for me to get down, so I went down several decks, and I ended up in a little room full of dials, knobs, and switches. And suddenly someone tapped me on the back and said, "What the hell are you doing down here?" And I turned, and it was a big, angry officer. And I said, "Well, I was hunting for something to sketch." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I'm an artist, and I wanted to make a sketch of something." And he said, "Well, if you're an artist, draw me a picture." So I said, "Stand there," and he stood in front of his desk, and I made a quick sketch of him and handed it to him, and he said, "Oh, wow, that's great." And he said, "Go ahead, make more pictures." And this loosened him up. He said, "I'm the first engineer on this ship." And then right then a big bell started clanging, and he picked up the phone and was saying, yeah, and nodded. And when he hung up, he said that was the old man bawling me out because the ship wasn't on an even keel. I said, "What do you mean, who was that?" And he said, "That was the captain up on the bridge." And he said this arrow, which was about a 4 or 5 foot arrow, would swing back and forth as the ship would list. And he said the captain has one like that up on the bridge. And if the ship is tilting or something and I don't do anything about it, well, he balls me out. But he started turning a bunch of knobs and switches. And what that did was put water ballast in the thing to keep it on an even keel. He looked at his watch and said, "My shift, I'm still first engineering, but my shift is ending." And he said, the second engineer will be coming along. I'll introduce you to him." And in a few minutes, he came in, and he was the second engineer. His name was Art Weiner. And we were introduced, and he wanted to see my sketches. And he said, "Come with me." So we went further down into the bowels of the ship, and it was like entering a big factory. There were generators, machinery running, penetrating noises, and on each side of the ship were large shafts, and he told me that was the propeller shafts going out the back end of the ship. But we went up the stairs to a little cubbyhole office. He said, "I have to have a cup of coffee." So he poured himself and me one. I'll never forget the wonderful taste of that coffee after the green stuff that we were drinking. And he said he was a photographer in civilian life and lived in New York and Brooklyn, and was very happy that me as an artist, we could talk photography. And we had a good conversation, and he wanted to know all about me. And he finally said, from now on, for the rest of the trip, he said, "I'm going to introduce you to a chef in a little kitchen. It's the captain's chef." And he said, "You go there each evening and he'll feed you." I couldn't believe this. So at 5 o'clock that evening, I climbed up out of our hole and went down on some passageways and knocked on the door of this cabin, and this little man in white aprons and a chef's hat said, "Howard?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Come in and sit down, and I'll feed you in a few minutes." And believe it or not, I had a beautiful tender filet, a beautiful salad, wonderful coffee, cherry pie a la mode. I thought I was in heaven. But he said, Art does that on every crossing. He picks one man out that he thinks will enjoy and deserve this. So he said, "You come here every night at 5 o'clock, and I'll feed you. I thought I was in heaven. But he told me about how proud he was that he was the captain's private chef and cooked meals for the captain and his staff. But he said every night, I'm not allowed to keep anything. I have to throw everything overboard, but at night, so that the submarines following don't know where we are. And he said this one night, I had a big tray of chicken left over, and I went up to a half door in the side of the ship to throw it overboard. And there were a group of soldiers standing around. I offered the chicken to them, and he said they all refused. So I threw the chicken overboard. And he said, do you know why they refused? And I said, I suppose because you're black. He said, that's right. He said, it broke my heart. But he said, every night now, I throw food overboard, and the fellows just stand there and watch me throw it over. And he said, it's a shame. But I had wonderful meals there. And one day, talking with Art, the second engineer, he said, you fellows stink. And I said, yes, we hadn't had showers or any wash since we were in the tar paper shacks in Boston, and the several days sleeping in our clothes down in this hot hold. So he said, here's my cabin number, you come down there. So when I went to the Merchant Marine's room there was it was a comfortable small room, 4 bunks for his other roommates, and they were studying for their promotions. But he handed me his robe and took me to a shower. And up until then, we didn't take showers because all the showers that were available were salt water. And if you could find a cake of soap, it wouldn't lather, and the salt water left your skin sticky anyway. But Art said, this is fresh water. And he said, put all your clothes in this bucket with a cake of soap. And he took a large length of pipe, and it was a steam pipe. He turned it on and stuck it down in the bucket and handed it to me. And he said, let the steam bubble through all your clothes in the bucket for several minutes, and then hang them up. And he brought me a fan, so I wrung my uniform and stuff out and hung it up to dry, and put the robe on and went back to his quarters, and he introduced me to the other Merchant Marine. And then about 10:30, one of the men said, who's hungry? And he looked at me and he said, would you like a piece of pie? And I couldn't believe it, but he came back in a few minutes with a cherry pie and ice cream. This was heaven, to think there were 5,000 men on this ship and I'm eating cherry pie. And it isn't like living in the tent up in Paris. I told them that I was down about 28 feet below the sea level and about 4 feet from the bulkhead. And I said, all night long, there's a scratching noise. It's like a big claw scraping along the side of the ship. And I said, I couldn't figure out what it was. And he said, oh, that's ships exploding depth charges when submarines are around. And I figured, being at the level I was, if we were hit, well, most of the fellows with that noise would take their blanket and go up on deck. And that was ridiculous, because up in the North Atlantic, in that cold water, you wouldn't survive over 2 or 3 minutes. So I figured, just relax. I was at peace with God. If we were hit, it would be quick, and let it go at that. It was interesting to me at night to be up in the bow of the ship as we dived into waves, because the whole bow of the ship would disappear. and then that water coming towards me, I would duck, and it would go over me. But it was kind of exciting. I'd tell the fellows about it. No one was interested. They all stayed below decks. And then someone tapped me on the back and said, "Get your butt below decks. You want to wash overboard?" And so I grabbed the railing, and the ship going up and down, I would skid, but holding onto the railing, I got back to the rear or the stern of the ship. And it was very interesting looking back at there were three of us ships in a row, and this great big ship behind us was bobbing around like a cork in a bathtub, or a toy in a bathtub, because it would turn in with jerks. And I could now understand why we all were walking with a funny walk. But it seemed very strange to see a big ship turning and tilting and everything. I thought it ought to twist or bend a little when it went. But while I was back there, the waves were getting higher, and there was a big thump, thump, thump. And I laid down on the deck and held onto the railing and leaned way out looking down. And when we would get down a wave, why, I could see both propellers thump, thump, thump on the water. And so that satisfied my curiosity on that. But what was interesting, when we would get down a wave, the horizon line would be way below me, and when we would go up a wave, the horizon line would be up above me. And when I stood up, I looked out, and there was a whole wall of water. I panicked. I thought we were sinking. But someone tapped me on the back and said, "Get below decks." I told the Art and the Merchant Marine about my experience out there, and they said, "Well, we're in over 50-foot waves right now." And I thought, "Ye gods, 50 ships out here going full speed, and 50-foot waves. It's a miracle any of us survive it." And then I reviewed my good fortune. As we approached England and France, why, there were some serious submarine attacks, and so they went back out. We went back out into the Atlantic, and turned and came back in, and going into Le Havre, why, Art took me on an elevator up to the top of the ship. And he stopped once and opened the elevator door and said, "Look," he said, "that's the bridge, and that's the captain there. Of course, we can't go out there, but I just wanted to show you where the bridge was." And we went on up, and one of the Merchant Marine handed me his field glasses, and I looked at Le Havre and the houses and buildings and the hills, and we kept passing the tops of massive ships that had been sunk, and then we pulled into a dock, and there was a ship laying on its side there. He said, "That's the Paris." It was a famous ocean liner that had been sunk. This was Le Havre. Of course, then we went on up into Normandy by truck to Lucky Strike. Oh, like I say, I was so fortunate overseas during the battle. I'll try to do something quickly. A distant relative's son was shot down on the first flight over, and she wrote and said that her son was in a cemetery near Chalons, which was northeast of Paris, And so I tried to get a pass to go up there. They wouldn't give me one, so I said, I either get a pass or I'll go AWOL and go up there. So I bummed a ride up to Chelan, and I think it was the 74th or 94th Division was there. I went to a colonel chaplain and told him I was hunting for a grave and that there was a cemetery in the area, and he said, there is one about 15 miles from here. He said, come back in the morning, find a place to sleep and eat, and come back in the morning and I'll have a Jeep and driver for you. And we went out to this, and it was a beautiful, beautifully maintained cemetery, crosses as far as you could see. And I went to the officer in charge, and there was a canvas enclosed area about the size of this room with dozens and dozens of bodies, all in mattress covers. This was graves registration, where they would dig up or gather bodies and pile them up. And then by the identifying of their dog tags, they would bury them. So I asked permission he showed me where his cross was, and I told him I'd like to make a little watercolor of it to send to his mother. So I went out to that, near the center of it, and sat on the ground and started to make a little painting. And the fellows coming back and forth with the stretchers with the guys' bodies in the mattress covers, they'd set it down to see how I was doing. What people don't realize, all those hundreds of thousands of bodies in mattress covers were not in caskets. Can you imagine trying to make caskets for... And so people picture those cemeteries with the soldiers in caskets. But they would dig the holes and drop the I remember one of them, when they set the stretcher down to see what I was doing, I said, good Lord, there's no arms or legs or head on it. And they said, well, he was in a tank. And that's ricochets in there. The Germans, they would put 3 or 4 in a hole because they had no identification. And I said, well, some of these crosses don't have dog tags on them. And they said, that's Air Force guys, because airplane wrecks, they usually gathered them up in a bucket and no dog tags. I thought, while I'm here, Reims isn't too far away, and I'll go look for the little red schoolhouse where they signed the treaty ending the war. And so I bummed the ride. The topography, or the countryside, was pretty much like Ohio, going from Chalons to Reims. And a truck picked me up and dropped me off there. And I went in the Notre Dame, or their cathedral there, and for a prayer, and had made some sketches. And then when I come out, I asked a man near there, I said, where's the little red schoolhouse where they signed the treaty? And he said, well, go up there about 4 blocks, cross over the railroad tracks and turn left. And this I did. I crossed over the little depression where the trains went, and then I turned left and walked a block or so, and I started thumbing. And a big 2.5-ton truck slammed his brakes on and says, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to the little red schoolhouse. And he said, okay, jump on. So I jumped on, and he started meshing his gears. He went about 30 feet, slammed the brakes on. I said, what's the matter? And he said, you've been standing in front of it, you damn fool. It was a red brick 3-story building, almost a block long. And of course I had pictured a little country schoolhouse, but this was the supreme headquarters for Eisenhower. And so I went into one end of it and asked a soldier I said, where's the room where they signed the treaties? And they said, up on the second floor and get out the hall. And you'll see it at the left. So I went up and went down, and I went into this room that about the size of 2 classrooms. And the walls were covered with maps, rope strings, and identification tabs. And I realized I was in the treaty room because it looked like the pictures with the Germans and the Russians and the British that I'd seen. And I examined the maps, and I found some of our maps that we had made were scale of 62/500. They had the wall maps were Mercator type maps, but there was no one in there. Papers and pencils and things on the desk, and I sat at the desk at one of the desks for about 15 minutes, just envisioning the signing of the treaty. I could have left there with a basket full of souvenirs, things in the desk, because really it looked like they had just gone out for lunch and were going to come back. But not being a souvenir gatherer, I didn't take any for souvenir. Now I wish I had, but after satisfying myself with the emotion of being in that room, then I left.